Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 133. Today we're talking about Ionic and some of the wonderful things they're doing with web components. I am one of your hosts today, Justin Ribeiro, and join me as always, we have Mr. Leon Revill.
Hello, everybody.
And Mr. Danny Blue.
Hey, everyone.
And before we jump in and introduce our guest this week, let's throw it over to the news desk with Leon and talk about this week in the web in 2 minutes or less. Mr. Leon.
Thank you, Justin. So straight into it. Mozilla moves the Shadow DOM feature backward from assigned to new, signaling that we're probably going to have to wait a little bit longer until we get full web component support in Firefox.
Boo.
The ability to import JavaScript modules via a script tag is available behind a flag in Chrome 60 and will be enabled by default in Chrome 61, which is due for release at the beginning of September. React 16 Beta is now available, which contains significant updates, including a rewrite of React Core. Safari Technology Preview is now available, which implements the JavaScript object spread feature. There's some web-RTC fixes and much more, so check it out. Most of you have probably heard of Slack, and it's just been recently announced that Slack is now valued at $5 billion. There's summits around for web devs everywhere. Upcoming summits include Polymer Summit on August the 22nd in Copenhagen, Microsoft Edge Web Summit, which is September the 13th in Seattle, and Chrome Dev Summit, which is October the 23rd in San Francisco. CSS Working Group is meeting at Mozilla Paris, where discussions of Houdini, frame animations, additive animations, and fonts level 4 working draft have been topics of discussion. And that's all for this week in web. Back over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. You know, it's funny. I saw a tweet the other day about Slack. They're using the debug build of React in some of their things, I guess, and someone pointed this out to them. So if you're wondering where all your RAM went, you know, maybe that was possibly the core case to do so. Though they are looking into it, is what I gathered from the very difficult tweet thread. I can never follow the threads on Twitter. It's very difficult, very difficult. But we're not here to talk about Twitter threads. Today we're here to talk about Ionic and web components, and our guest this week, Mr. Justin Willis. Justin, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me on.
So, Justin, tell us a little bit about yourself. How'd you get started on the web? What are you up to these days?
Yeah, so actually I started, I was working as a dishwasher at a grocery store called Earthfare, which was kind of like Whole Foods, but not as nice as Whole Foods, and decided that I kind of wanted to, do something different, maybe make a little bit more money, and do something really cool. So I started just Googling, like, making websites, HTML5, that kind of stuff. Got into kind of making like games with like 3JS and cool little HTML5 games. And through that, decided that, hey, I can start freelancing and probably make some good money doing like just making websites and stuff like that. So I started freelancing and from then on just got my first job or official like full-time web development job through freelancing. And then, a couple of years later, and here I am at Ionic. So here at Ionic, I'm a support engineer. So if you ever come onto like our GitHub repos, I'll probably be the one responding to you. I also work on the framework. I've done some work on the backend stuff. Pretty much everything I've had at least a couple of fingers in.
So I presume you're using mostly front page to do most of your web development work today. Is that the general gist? No one remembers front page. I feel like I should bring it up every 7th episode or so.
Oh dear. So for those who don't know what Ionic is, could you just give us a little bit of a background, just a generic overview of the project Ionic?
Yep. So Ionic, we are a web framework that allows you to build cool hybrid mobile apps, Electron apps, and progressive web apps, all from one code base. So Ionic, we have all these nice, pretty components built on top of Angular that look like the native design language of the device that you're using. So on Android, it looks like Material Design. iOS, it looks like the iOS design language. and yeah, enables web developers to build, onto platforms that in the past wasn't really available to web developers. Yeah, you can build one code base and deploy to all these different things because of how awesome the web is and how it runs pretty much everywhere. So you can ship one Ionic app and have it running everywhere from your Xbox One to your mobile device. And we're currently built on Angular, so you get all the goodness of Angular along with all our pretty components. So yeah, that's pretty much the overall gist of it.
And Ionic's been around for quite a long time now, it should be pointed out.
Yep.
Back in the dark days of how does one build a cross-platform application for devices that realistically hate each other, Ionic was sort of that bridge, right? I mean, a lot of people built on top of Ionic to be able to sort of target these things. And initially, it was very much just a Cordova sort of thing, wasn't it?
Yeah. So our core, especially back in Ionic 1 days, this was before kind of like PWA is really a thing that were talked about. We were definitely very Cordova focused. So, if nobody wants to write Java, nobody wants to write Objective-C, but hey, JavaScript is pretty easy to learn. And HTML and CSS, those are also, extremely easy to learn. So we wanted to take, these really nice accessible things and programming languages and enable these developers to also build onto mobile devices and have their apps in the App Store, the Google Play Store, right alongside with all those native apps out there, and be able to deliver a really good experience to to users of those apps, all using just web standards and web tech.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with you. I don't think anyone in the history of the world wants to learn Objective-C. I don't think that's...
I agree.
No.
I agree. I don't even want to look at Objective-C. It's completely unreadable to me. But hey, what do I know?
It's tough. It's tough.
So the idea is, or at least it was, is you have the framework, you can build out your applications, and then you can wrap those up in a Cordova application, in a Cordova shell, and it appears to be just like a native app. Does Ionic still rely on Cordova? Does it have its own CLI tools or its own shell nowadays, or what's the story there?
Yeah, so underneath the hood, we do use Cordova if you want to deploy to a mobile platform, or I should say a native like mobile platform. So if you want to have your app in the Google Play Store. So we are currently built on Angular 2. We have our Ionic CLI that kind of like abstracts all the kind of funky Cordova stuff and makes it really easy to, so if you want to run an app on your Android device, it's one command, it's Ionic Cordova run Android. And all of a sudden you have this app that you built running on your device. Also to wrap Cordova plugins, we have a project called Ionic Native. So what that does is it gives you a nice like Angular-like API with observables and all that good stuff to wrap all these Cordova plugins, and gives you kind of a nice API that is very consistent across all the plugins, so that you can access these native platform features, like native device features, that back in the day you could really only access if you were writing Java or Objective-C. These Cordova plugins give you like a nice JavaScript bridge to access things like Bluetooth and the camera and vibration and notifications and stuff like that. So yeah, we have our own CLI, Ionic CLI. That interfaces really nicely with the Ionic Angular framework, and we also have Ionic Native. And you put all that together and you can make really cool apps.
It seems like every project nowadays has got to have a CLI, otherwise it's not cool.
For sure. Yeah, we like to we feel like we can give our developers the best user experience if we kind of control the CLI and abstract away all the like crazy build stuff. And who wants to set up like a Webpack config themselves? I mean, you can do it, but it's a lot easier when you can just run Ionic Serve, and our app scripts handles all the or the app scripts and CLI handles all the Angular build process stuff for you.
Yeah,
it makes it just really easy to get started in building a nice mobile app. And also, we with Ionic 2, we're not as Cordova focused as back in the day. So progressive web apps, we are really huge into progressive web apps. So Ionic, because we are just built with web technology, you can easily put your do a prod build and take your www folder, put that on your web server, and you have a really nice progressive web app. And also, we target Electron too, so you can build desktop applications also using Ionic.
Does the Ionic CLI play nicely with Angular CLI, or are they two just totally different things?
Yeah, so we do think of them as two totally separate things. It is possible, and I have seen people using like the Angular CLI to build Ionic applications, but it does require some Webpack config and some other things. We do a lot of like custom optimizations and stuff in our Ionic CLI, and it also interfaces really nice with like our Ionic View app and stuff like that. So we tend to think that they're kind of two separate things. If you want to build an Ionic application, you should probably use the Ionic CLI if you're looking for the best user experience.
But it will work with any other published, Angular modules and that kind of stuff. Like there are no limitations on the Ionic CLI. Just because it's not using the Angular CLI, it's still going to work with all of the other Angular modules and stuff that you would download and use.
Oh yeah. So since we're built on Angular, all of our stuff is Angular. The Ionic CLI is built right now as it stands to build Angular, applications that are using Angular. So you can install pretty much any Angular module out there that's been kept up to date and works with AOT compiling. Will work perfectly fine with Ionic Angular applications.
Cool. I have a couple of questions. The first one regarding cutover plugins. There's no limitation either on what cutover plugins that you can use. It's not, you don't have to have Ionic compatible cutover plugins, correct? And at the end of the day, these plugins just expose JavaScript, so you can go ahead and do whatever you want, because there's a lot of those, and there's a lot of cutover plugins which offer some really great native functionality for hybrid applications. So.
Oh yeah, totally agreed. So kind of the one of the awesome things about web technology and Ionic and us being built on web tech is it is just JavaScript at the end of the day. So any Cordova plugin that you want to use, even if we don't have an Ionic native wrapper, you don't even have to use Ionic native. You can just use the plain Cordova API that the Cordova plugin exposes. So yeah, any of the Cordova plugins out there, pretty much, unless like there's like an actual bug in the Cordova plugin itself, work perfectly fine in Ionic.
Cool. Okay, so my second question is, you mentioned that Ionic has been built on top of Angular 2, but Ionic's obviously been around a lot longer than Angular 2 has, so it must have been written in Angular JS at one point. So what was that transition like?
Yeah, so Ionic was originally built in Angular JS. Ionic 1 was Angular JS. Ionic 2 was a complete rewrite.
Cool.
What were you saying? I'm sorry.
Oh. I'm sorry, I was just, yeah.
Ionic 2 was a complete rewrite. It is now using Angular 2 and, Angular 3 and Angular 4 and up. But it is possible, and companies like Untapped have built, who originally had Ionic 1 applications. They're now running on Ionic 2. It is a pretty decent upgrade to move from Ionic 1 to Ionic 2, 3, 2 plus. But it is, it is pretty worth the squeeze. The performance is a lot better. All the components have been updated and look really nice and updated to follow all the new design standards. It's a pretty big upgrade, but it was definitely worth the squeeze.
Cool. Sounds awesome.
Sorry, I'm digging through some of the Ionic stuff now. I've not built anything with Ionic 2. Okay. But I did build several things with the original Ionic, and the overall development experience was really, really nice. But you mentioned kind of a push. In general, there's kind of a push for PWAs. So how specifically does Ionic work with? Like, does Ionic have any built-in tools to help you with PWAs? Does it help you generating your service worker files or anything like that, or is it just that you can take this and make it a PWA and it's designed to work well on web as well as on in a Cordova wrapper?
Yeah, definitely. So that's a really good question. So out of the box, we do provide a web manifest. So really, there's two important things needed for every PWA to be able to enable that add to home screen experience, and that's a service worker and a web manifest. So out of the box, when you start a new Ionic application, it does provide you with a web manifest that's already like set up with all the normal fields that you would have in your manifest. And it's also set up with a service worker out of the box. So currently we use SW Toolbox. We will be upgrading to Workbox in the future, near future. And that provides you a nice, service worker kind of library ready for you to go. And our out of the box service worker is set up to basically be able to handle the basic use case that you would want for most PWAs that you build. And of course, you can use SW Toolbox's really nice APIs to be able to expand on that. And we even in our index.html already have the code to register your service worker. So if you want to enable that, all you have to do is uncomment that little bit of JavaScript. We already have your manifest ready for you. All you got to do is update or upload the www folder to your hosting service. And you will have a PWA right out of the box ready to go.
That's excellent. As little friction as possible.
Yep, that's where we're aiming. So yeah, Ionic is all about making things easy as possible. So everything we can do to make it easier to do something, we try to do that.
So you mentioned that Ionic also supports desktop applications, and how does the UI need to change to support the desktop? Because obviously having a mobile-based UI probably wouldn't fit quite as well on the desktop. Is there any provision for changing the UIs based on what platform you're on, etc.? I know you already mentioned that there's differences between how it looks on iOS and Android, for example, but what's the story there?
Yeah, so back in the first couple of Ionic 3 releases, we had a pretty big push to make sure that our components look good on desktop. So we went through our components and some CSS media queries here and there to make sure that out of the box they look pretty good on desktop. We also built an Ionic Grid component. So this is a CSS. You can think of it as like Bootstrap CSS grid, but it's built to work with Ionic applications. And this allows you to, on desktop applications, have that, nice desktop look, but it responsively changes, so when you look out, you can have the same code base on your mobile app and it'll look like a mobile app, and then you can, using that grid, you can lay out things to where they look better on desktop, and it's all responsive. It uses Flexbox underneath, so it's all pretty good. So yeah, out of the box, you can make a pretty good looking desktop application using just our standard components. And the cool thing about Ionic is, since it is just web technology, it is just CSS. So you can customize and style things to your heart's content to get a good looking Ionic desktop application. But out of the box, we do provide a pretty good design experience for desktop, along with obviously mobile too.
Awesome.
So you just mentioned like CSS and some of the grid stuff that you all support. Does the Ionic CLI support any CSS preprocessors?
Yeah. So out of the box, we use Sass. So that's out of the box supported in our Ionic CLI. So we use Sass just because it enables some. Of course, in CSS itself, there are some things coming up. So like CSS variables work almost exactly like Sass variables. But we still find that some of the things in Sass, like color maps and stuff like that, enable some really cool things that you can do with Sass. But the cool thing about Sass is it is just CSS at the end of the day. So you don't even have to really know what Sass is if you just want to write CSS. The only difference will be instead of .css, it'll be .sass. But you can also have you can access all the really cool, powerful features that Sass brings. That's the only CSS preprocessor we use, or that our Ionic CLI supports out of the box. But I'm pretty sure you could, if you wanted to, you could get in and set up like less or something like that. But out of the box, we only support Sass.
Okay.
So I'd like to talk just briefly about the Ionic Developer Survey that was results were released recently. So obviously, I think the results may be slightly biased, obviously, with the type of people that are taking that survey. But it's quite obvious that there's an increase in the amount of people actually building hybrid applications as opposed to native applications. And obviously, the native hybrid has kind of been a raging debate for many years now. Why do you think now more and more people are building hybrid applications?
So I think it's a combination of things, but I'll just kind of go over like what I think the core things are. So first of all, it's just ease of development, and along with that, speed of development. So and I may just be biased on this because I'm a web developer, but I think that JavaScript, CSS, and HTML are much easier to learn, much easier to get started with, and much easier to just build out the features that you need without having to deal with Java or Objective-C or even Swift. Swift is a nice language, but I still think JavaScript is much easier. And also like speed of development. So as I mentioned, I feel like with JavaScript, it's a lot easier to just start building out all these cool features just because of how easy JavaScript is. The other thing is I think there's a lot more web developers, and I think the numbers show that, than there are actual like native application developers. And Ionic, the mobile world is obviously really huge. The mobile platform is really important. And since we enable web developers to just bring their same skills that they already know from building websites and web apps over to building like mobile applications. I think that's a pretty huge draw to people wanting to build hybrid apps instead of native apps. And also just the web has gotten really awesome over the last couple of years. So back in the day when Ionic 1 first started, we didn't have any of these cool like CSS performance APIs like CSS containment, CSS will change so you can control your layers. And performance on web has just gotten like incredible in the last few years compared to, back when Ionic first started. And I think, so one of the things that people have always said about hybrid apps is they tend to be slower than native applications. But I think with the modern web and the APIs that web standards have brought us, I don't think that really applies anymore. So I think, in my opinion, and obviously I'm pretty biased, but I think native really only makes sense anymore if you're going to build like huge games. And even with WebAssembly, that's changing, but that's another topic. And I think for hybrid, it just kind of makes sense if you want to move fast and you just want to build a great application and you don't, you just want to get things done. I think hybrid makes a lot more sense. And also for businesses too. So web developers it's way easier to find and hire web developers than it is to find and hire native developers. So I think that makes a pretty good incentive for businesses to also use Ionic because they probably already have some web developers that are working. And using Ionic, they can easily shift over to being mobile developers. So I think that's just a few of the things, few of the reasons why hybrid is taking off so fast compared to native development.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of those points. In particular, the capability of the web nowadays. I've been building hybrid applications for a good few years now, and when we started out, it was difficult to try and match the speed and user experience of native applications. But now it's so much easier just because of the capabilities of the different web views and the technologies available and all the things you mentioned there. So completely agree.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's much easier to attain 60 frames per second nowadays than it used to be. The web platform has so many cool performance APIs that enable you to make sure that you can hit that magic 60 frames per second on pretty much any device out there.
Well, I think it's tough too. I mean, you talk about, if you're a ginormous business, you can probably afford to, spend the time, effort, and money to develop a wide-ranging set of applications that are specific to each platform. But the hybrid situation, I mean, it basically makes platforms that were realistically unattainable because of the cost, in most cases, to develop specifically for those platforms. It puts it a lot closer to most businesses who might be smaller, who might be looking to make some penetration into those rates. So the hybrid application really has sort of bridge that gap, so to speak. And beforehand, it's always been kind of seen as second class, but these days it's really not the case, as you've very well pointed out there.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, and just from speaking to a lot of big, or a lot of companies, they tend to have not even apps that they're putting in like the App Store and the Google Play Store, but also just apps that they're using internally for like, their employees to use. So, to track their time or track their hours or something like that. And I think when you're just trying to get apps out, and really good applications, really that provide a really good user experience, and you need a few different applications, internal applications. I think it makes a lot more sense to build a hybrid app, because who wants to take the time and effort to write an Android application and then write a iOS application and maybe even a Windows Phone application, if you're if you're using Windows, when you can just build one code base and and have something ready to ship to all your employees, no matter what devices that they're using, in a much shorter time span and with only one code base, compared to if you're building two different native applications, just so that all your employees can use the apps that you want them to be able to use.
I have a quick question. How many people do you know of typically developing for Windows Phone? I know you mentioned it there. It seems to be kind of a really small section of people nowadays. I was just wondering what your experience was. 6. Yeah, I usually quote around 4 people. But yeah, I'd like to know your thoughts on that. Just
Windows Phone.
So I actually know nobody that builds Windows mobile applications. So the cool thing, so Windows 10 UWP applications, we do support those, and actually, so like you can use the Cordova Windows, Windows 10 platform to build Windows 10 UWP apps. I think those are really cool. I actually just switched over to a Surface Book not long ago, so I'm kind of getting on the Windows bandwagon, or Windows 10 bandwagon. But so those are cool, and those allow you to build a Windows 10 app that runs across all Windows 10 devices, which does include some Windows 10 mobile devices, although I don't know of anybody who actually uses Windows 10 mobile. But yeah, so Windows as a platform is you can definitely build Ionic applications for it. It just, you got to keep in mind that most of your Windows users are going to be either using a laptop or a desktop, or even in the near future with the Fall Creators update, Xbox. So, but yeah, I don't know of anybody who actually builds Windows 10 mobile applications or Windows Phone applications.
To some extent, it's a shame. I think choice is always, generally leads to more interesting innovations. And the Windows Phone wasn't terrible per se.
Wasn't good either.
Yeah, but at least it was there, and it's just a shocking set of things. But then again, you're also talking to someone who had to work on Windows CE, so it's you go, this could have been, and then it wasn't.
I was actually pushing
and you think of Nokia
for Firefox OS, so I thought that was really cool, and I actually did some PRs and stuff to get, or not Gaia, which was like the front end part of Firefox OS. But unfortunately that didn't really go anywhere either.
Yeah. Again, or, operating systems looking for a market that doesn't exist, I guess, because at the end of the day, you need apps, and maybe if progressive web apps had been more of a thing at that time, because I actually shipped some stuff for some clients into Firefox OS. What was it called? Marketplace, if I remember correctly. Back in the day. As a matter of fact, I just got an email from Marketplace telling me that one of those apps is inaccessible now, to which I was like, I didn't know that subsystem was still running. But I guess apparently it is.
Nice.
So we've talked a little bit about PWAs. We've, kind of talked about the Cordova thing, but we're nearly half an hour in, and we have not yet brought up the fact that Ionic and Web Components, this is now a thing. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so it's been a little bit of a journey to get here. So we really like Angular. You can build really cool, people do build really cool things with Angular. But Ionic as a platform, we really love the web. We like web standards. We like to, the browser provides all kinds of really cool things nowadays. that allow you to build, really cool things without having to ship a bunch of JavaScript. And PWAs, we are really pushing hard for PWAs here at Ionic. We think there's a lot of, not even just in the consumer world, but also in the enterprise world. It's even easier to just push something to your web server and push updates to your application running on your web server than it is to try to, especially on iOS, to try to get your application out to people using iOS. And you have to go through the App Store and wait a couple of days while they try to approve your stuff and all this good stuff. And a big part of PWAs is performance and being able for, no matter what device you're using, no matter what network you happen to be on, no matter how slow that network is, you want the application to be accessible by everyone and have it load fast and have them have a good user experience. And if you're shipping a lot of JavaScript, not only on network time is that going to cause an issue, but also on parse time on the device. So something like a Moto G, which is a very, very, very common device, parsing JavaScript is not a trivial thing. It takes a lot of time and a lot of CPU. And when you don't have a lot of CPU and you don't have a lot of time, that can be pretty challenging. So to go into that, we're kind of looking at like what the platform provides, and web components have been a thing for a while. But it wasn't until the V1 spec of web components came out that it kind of really started to catch on cross-browser and be an actual, or what we think is an actual solution that you can actually like really ship and have people use across no matter what browser they're using. So all these combination of things, wanting to ship less JavaScript and really pushing for PWAs and wanting performance, especially load time performance. No matter what device, what network you're using, to be good. And also just having this love of like the platform and wanting to be able to use like what the browser provides and not have, abstractions across that. And also wanting to be able to use like, hey, what if I wanted to use Ionic components to get our nice like pre-built, nice looking components that have the CSS modes and stuff like that. But maybe you don't want to use Angular. Maybe you want to use React or Preact or Vue or whatever the cool framework of tomorrow is. Seems like that changes even more often nowadays. But the web components are built into the browser. It's a spec thing. It provides something that it just works in the browser. It doesn't matter what you're wrapping it with or anything like that. It just works because it's actually built into the browser. So we've started, and it's still in heavy development. We're not totally ready to go like super public with it yet, but we built this thing called Stencil, which is basically a build tool for making it really easy to build web components that work across browser. So we took some of the things that we like from Angular, some of the things that we like from React, some of the things we like from Vue, and kind of combined those into this cool syntax that allows you to build really small, really performant web components and use them across whatever framework or whatever that you want to build. So they're lazy loaded by default. So there's no setup, there's no ng modules or anything like that. They're code split by default without any kind of setup or anything. We rely on the browser to basically tell us when a component is needed, and then we async go out and grab that component and pull it in. So for example, if you have like an application that has 3 pages, and on that first view that you're trying to load, you're only using like 3 Ionic components, we are only going to pull in the JavaScript and CSS needed for just those 3 components. And you don't have to set up Webpack, you don't have to set up any ng modules or anything like that. No special lazy loading or anything. We just rely on the browser to say, hey, I just saw this HTML tag. It looks like we have a custom elements definition for that. And then our little 6 kilobyte runtime will go out and JSONP and get that definition and hydrate the component. And this is all just using web standards and how custom elements work. And then you get this nice Ionic component on your page. The cool thing is we're in the next Ionic Angular 4. We're planning on shipping So it's going to be the same Ionic Angular that you've always used and loved, but under the hood, it's going to be using web components, so Ionic Web Components instead of Ionic components that are built with Angular. And the reason we're doing this is for smaller code size, ease of use, code splitting out of the box, that kind of thing. So you'll just be able to update. There's going to be a few small breaking changes, but mostly stuff that you could just do with find and replace in VS Code. And then you'll get a faster, smaller application right out of the box. And then along with this, we're actually building if anybody knows it, the conference app, which is kind of like our standard demo app that we use to demo Ionic Angular. We're building a React version of that in-house now to kind of show like how Ionic components can now be used across different frameworks. We're seeing some huge performance increases, much smaller. I mean, just to give you an example, like Ion header is now like less than a kilobyte almost with our web component version compared to a couple of kilobytes with the Angular version. You much smaller code size, lazy loading, code splitting, and it's all just using web standards now. Nothing proprietary or special or anything like that.
That sounds absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
It certainly sounds like a lot of work as well, and it's so nice to see, somebody doing this transition to web components and obviously getting some great benefits from it. That's amazing to hear.
It's really, really cool. We'll have more to share as time goes on, but the performance numbers that we're seeing in house are pretty epic, if I can say that.
Have you got any numbers you can share with us?
So we have some numbers, a little bit of numbers that I can share. So the cool thing about Stencil is so we have our Ionic core components, and those are the Ionic components that you've always seen, but they're built with Stencil, and you can use those components. So if you know anything about Polymer, with Polymer you can use Polymer to build components that you can use in other frameworks, and you can share Polymer components, and they work anywhere just because it's just web components. And you can also build apps completely with Polymer, so you can build an app that's just web components. So we have the Hacker News app is kind of the new thing that you use to benchmark, I guess, what you're doing. And we have a Hacker News application that I built using our Stencil Ionic core components, and on emerging markets 3G. So on web page tests, which is like this cool tool that lets you test your PWAs across different networks and different devices. So on a Moto G, on emerging markets 3G, we were getting 2.7 seconds to interactive on that device and that network. And that's not even on the latest version of what we were building internally. So we have some cool stuff that we're doing with pre-rendering and stuff like that to get it even smaller or even faster. So by the time we're ready to actually come totally public with this stuff, I'm looking at probably the 1.8 to 2 second to interactive range, which is pretty blazing fast. And then I have another demo that's doesn't use any of the Ionic core components. It's just custom Stencil components that I built. And that's actually 1.5 seconds to interactive on the same Moto G, first generation Moto G, and emerging markets 3G. And it only takes, for example, 39 kilobytes of code for the Hacker News app to actually render that first view. So 39 kilobytes of JavaScript. So that 39 kilobytes is the JavaScript, CSS, and even images needed for that first view. So it only takes 39 kilobytes of assets to actually render the first view, which for PWAs, and you're going to be pushing PWAs. The kind of target market are places where networks are really slow, but not even that, but data is also really expensive. So every kilobyte really counts towards how much you're paying for data. So when you're only taking 39 kilobytes of data to load, that efficiency that brings is extremely important. So yeah, we're seeing some pretty crazy numbers right now. I'm very, very happy with the numbers, and we'll have much more demos and stuff to share in the near future.
So is Stencil a framework?
No, Stencil is not a framework. So Stencil is just a build tool, and really for the majority, so I would say 99% of people that build Ionic apps, you don't even have to actually know what Stencil is. It's just a build tool that allows you to build like really cool web components that you can use anywhere. So it's just a little library build tool that allows you to build web components that are fast and small and provides nice syntax to do that.
But there is a stencil runtime?
Yeah, so there is a small 6 kilobyte gzipped runtime.
Okay.
And basically all that does is just, well, first, it smartly loads the web components polyfills. So it does feature detection to know when it needs to download and get the custom elements polyfill or the shadow DOM polyfill, depending on what browser the user is using, which with V1 web components on Chrome and Safari, you don't need any polyfills because they're just supported in the browser. And then for Edge and Firefox, it will smartly download and get those polyfills running. And then it also just contains a little bit of code to lazy load the components that you're running on your page. But beyond that, it doesn't actually do anything. It's just web standards and JavaScript and literally just vanilla V1 web components.
So how does it handle? I have a bunch of questions, and if you're not ready to talk about some of this stuff yet, that's
Okay.
totally fine. But I'm curious how the build tool handles classes, because
That
for just a little bit of background, so for anybody that doesn't know, if you build a custom element, a native JavaScript class to extend HTML element, if you compile that into ES5 constructor functions, it won't work unless you include an extra shim. And so I'm curious how Stencil works around some of this, if it loads the native ES6 bundle, if those features are available, or does it always ship the shim with it?
Yeah, so currently we do use, there's a little build shim that I think it's on the Web Components JS GitHub, but it's just a tiny little shim that basically makes ES5 work nicely with V1 Web Components. So as it sits currently, we always ship ES5.
Okay.
We aren't completely ready to take the leap to mainly ES6 like Polymer has. That'll probably change in the near future. But yeah, right now we always ship ES5, we just use that little build shim to make it work nicely.
Okay. I have, and then I have one more question, and then I'll be quiet for a little bit. So I think a lot of that stuff sounds really cool, and I like the idea. And I've talked before that how easy the interop is between Angular and web components. A part that I am curious about is one of the really cool things about Angular is the Angular language service that is provided.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming if you are replacing all of the Angular components with, if you're replacing all of the Angular components with native web components, that's awesome. But I'm assuming that you are then using the custom elements schema inside of the Angular module, and that would also mean that we'd lose out on some of the IntelliSense and stuff that you get with Angular components. Is there anything that you guys are doing to address some of that tooling that you do lose by moving to web components?
Sure. So that's a really good question, and it's actually something that we haven't really addressed yet. So when all of the Ionic components in an Ionic Angular v4 application are going to be web components. So we are having to use the custom element schema in Angular to get Angular to work nicely with web components. So yeah, honestly, that's a good question, and it's probably something we should look into. That is not something that we have actually gotten to yet. But yeah, really good question.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I've played around a little bit with local builds of Angular, trying to provide custom schemas and stuff like that, and I haven't really gotten anywhere yet. But so I was curious if that was something, because I think it's awesome that it's moving to web components, but that is a benefit of Angular that we would lose out on. So I'm very curious how you guys decide to tackle that, if you do decide to tackle it.
Yeah, for sure. So our goal is to make with Ionic Angular, a lot of people have Ionic Angular applications already built. So our end goal is to make it as transparent as possible. So like I mentioned earlier, for 99% of people, you don't have to know anything about Stencil. And really, you don't even have to know that you're using web components. When you use an Ionic component, that you're using web components. The end goal is that the same, and it's the same Ionic that you've used, or the same Ionic Angular that you've used, for years. But it's just web components underneath. But the end goal is that you don't even have to know that. And from internal testing and stuff like that, it is just that easy. You don't have to know about it. I can just plug in the same Ion header that I've always plugged in, or same Ion button, and it just works. And I think that comes down to like how cool web components are, and how it is something that is built into the browser. And the browser and all this native C++ is what's providing the component model and stuff like that. We don't have to write a bunch of JavaScript to get a component model. It's just right there in the browser. So yeah, I think our end goal is that it's just completely transparent, and you don't even have to know about it. And so far,
no, I totally agree. I'm just a developer, so I need to find things to complain about.
Yeah, definitely. No, that is definitely something we should definitely look into, the Angular language service. I haven't thought about how that works with like custom schemas and web components in general. And we work with the Angular people too, so maybe that is something we could talk to them about and see how we could get that working. But yeah, no, that was a great question.
Yeah, no, I'd be very interested to how you tackle it if you do end up talking to them.
Cool, sounds good.
So I'm going to ask the question that Danny didn't ask, because it's a super important question. And when the words web components come up on the show, it cannot go unasked, which is, are you in favor of the, how do you like the Shadow DOM?
Yeah.
To which, thank you, Danny, for pinging me on that Trey tweet a couple days ago, which I just only saw because I have not been on the Twitters lately. And I have thoughts. I have feelings. I'm curious, because Danny and I and Leon, we often argue about this. How do you feel about the Shadow DOM?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, actually. Stencil does support using Shadow DOM, so if you want to build components, you can use Shadow DOM. By default, we are not using Shadow DOM though. And just real quickly, I think the cool thing about like V1 Web Component spec is custom elements, Shadow DOM, HTML imports, all this stuff are separate specifications, and you don't have to actually use every single one of those if you don't want to. But yeah, so by default, we're not using Shadow DOM, and one of the main reasons for this actually, and it's kind of a funny thing, because Shadow DOM hasn't really been like a crazy or a big thing in the past. It was only supported in Chrome, and we didn't feel comfortable shipping something like that. We have all this CSS that has been built and built to be scoped by default using traditional ways of scoping your CSS. And we found that if we wanted to use Shadow DOM by default, we would have to rewrite a bunch of that CSS, and we have a lot of CSS. And so yeah, we just didn't want to rebuild all of that CSS to work with Shadow DOM when our CSS already is scoped and it is scoped to components and stuff like that out of the box. So yeah, by default, we're not using Shadow DOM, although you still can turn it on if you want to build like custom stencil components. It's just a flag or in the decorator. But yeah, by default, we're not using Shadow DOM. And actually,
decorator, you say,
with the Chrome team, and actually they were, they agreed with us that the cool thing about Web Component spec is that you don't have to use every single part of the spec to make cool things with it. Yeah, by default, we're not using Shadow DOM, although we do support it. And if you want to turn it on, you can.
I think that's entirely reasonable. I know that I enjoy the Shadow DOM, though I admit that it has its uses and non-uses, and particularly the V0 side of life was tough. The polyfill was slow. We all knew this, and I feel like that lingers, though. I feel like it lingers.
Yeah. So I agree with you there, actually. So yeah. So the V1 Shadow DOM and the V1 Web Component spec in general is, in my opinion, miles ahead of where it was with V0. A lot of the concerns that people tend to have about web components nowadays are not a thing anymore with V1 Web Components, and I think that's an important thing to remember when looking at web components. Is basically just don't compare what we have now with like the V0 Web Component spec, because there was some issues there, but the browser vendors got together and came up with the V1 spec, which fixed a lot of those issues. And yeah, so we think Shadow DOM is really cool. It is really cool. It's just we didn't want to have to, we already had all our CSS scoped and everything, and it would have been a huge project to rewrite all of that CSS. And then we would also have to add CSS variables everywhere so that people can customize our components really easily to be able to penetrate the Shadow DOM. So yeah, we decided to not turn it on by default.
And if you're supporting platforms which don't yet actually have native support for Shadow DOM, you get into all kinds of crazy situations with the CSS styling and scoping there. Obviously, there's a shady CSS polyfill to allow you to add some scoping that way, but still, you get strange behaviors if you're obviously moving between the supported platforms and non-supported platforms. So I can see why that would be a really big problem to try and solve.
Yeah, definitely. And I expect, in the future, maybe in a couple of years, that we'll probably start using Shadow DOM, because by then it should be in Edge and Firefox too. And like I said, it is possible to turn it on in Stencil if you want to. And on the polyfill side of things too, since we're basically just using custom elements, the custom elements part of the spec by default, on browsers that need it, so Edge and Firefox currently, that is only one polyfill that we have to download instead of downloading the custom elements polyfill and the Shadow DOM polyfill. And yeah, for PWAs, when code size really, 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 really is important, I think that's a good win.
Well, we're running up against time, as it were. Are there any questions we have failed to ask you, Justin, that you feel like we should have asked you?
No, not really. So yeah, we'll be speaking at the Polymer Summit coming up. So Max is going to have some really, really cool things to share there about all the things that I just talked about. We'll have a lot more numbers to share. I've been working with Max over the last couple of days to gather performance numbers and stuff to share like that. So way more than I was able to share here. And also Josh, who is one of the framework developers, he's not speaking at the React conference coming up, but he is going to be there, and he's got a cool demo application that uses Ionic Web Components in a React application. So yeah, if you're going to the React, I think it's React Rally that's coming up, yeah, he's going to be there, and yeah, he's got some cool stencil/Ionic/React stuff to share.
Fantastic. And if people want to find you online to chit-chat about Ionic, Web Components, all the Angular things, where would they look for you?
Yeah, so Twitter is probably the best way to hit me up. So I'm at JustinWillis96 on Twitter. So yeah, feel free to hit me up on there. I am pretty addicted to Twitter, so I'm on it a lot. So yeah, feel free to shoot me. I think my DMs are open, so feel free to shoot me a DM, or you can just tweet at me, and usually I'll respond pretty fast.
Well, Justin, thank you so very much for being on the show. We greatly appreciate it. Some absolutely wonderful things you guys are doing over there at Ionic.
Thank you. Yeah, great for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Danny, Leon, anything to add before we sign off this week?
Shadow DOM is one of it. Shadow DOM's not ready yet.
We will argue about this later. Well, you're going to make me get on Twitter, Danny. You're going to make me get on the Twitter.
Thank you for coming, Justin. Really appreciate it.
Oh, also thank you, Justin.
Yep, thank you.
And this has been episode number 133 of the Web Platform Podcast, Ionic and Web Components, and all the wonderfulness of the web. We have been your hosts, Justin Ribeiro, Leon Revill, and Danny Blue. Tune in next week when we talk about more things about the web. Thank you so very much, and I'll have a wonderful rest of your week.
Bye, everybody.